So we are now ready to start sewing our caftan. I'm going to follow the instructions as they appear here in the booklet. Oh, lots of laying out plans there. Okay. So, and just as I start talking, they start chopping down trees again. Okay. First of all, prepare pattern pieces. Well, we've done that and we've added the interfacing. So if you're doing view C with the tie straps, then that's the first stage we're going to do. So take your tie straps if you're using them and fold them in half, right sides together, raw edges matching lengthways. This will help when you sew them. If the fabric's being pressed, it's going to behave itself. So take each strap and just press in half. You've got 2 straps to do like this. So there we go, pressed in half with right sides on the inside. What we're going to do now is take this over to the sewing machine and just sew along here. So there's our straps pressed in half. Now if you want, there are 2 ways of turning these through. What we're going to do is we're going to sew 6mm in from the edge, so really narrow seam allowance all the way down. And the way that they talk about turning them out on the instruction booklet is that you would attach a safety pin and then wiggle it through and kind of caterpillar it back on itself in order to gradually turn that strap inside out. I've got these here, which are Prim or Preem turners, medium and large. They come in a set of 2. I'm just going to have a go at using this narrow strap turner. If you have a drinking straw and a kebab skewer or chopstick, you might find that you can also use that. So I'm going to give that a try anyway. Now, if you're using the safety pin method, then you're going to leave that end open. You're going to leave both ends open and you're just going to sew down the side. If you're using the turning straw or turning tool method, then we're going to close off one of those ends. So what I'll do now is I'll just pop that under that foot there, and I just want to use a really nice narrow seam allowance, little back stitch to secure those, and then off I go. I'm just using a straight stitch, my default stitch length on my machine, which is 2.2, and as you can see, I'm just using my eye to line up this raw edge with the sort of halfway point on that presser foot. So if you just find a reference point, you obviously haven't got a 0.6cm guideline on your needle plate, so it's a case of just finding a reference point and then sticking with it. So there it is, all sewn. So I've got the end closed off there, and then I've sewn all the way down through the length of that rather long strap, and then I've just done a back stitch at the end. So what I want to do is take the straw part of my turner and stick it into my strap. It's a bit of a squeeze actually, but the smaller of the 2 turners is just about big enough. So I'm just going to push that through, push my strap all the way onto there. So I've now pushed that turner, it's in there, all the way to the end of my strap. I now take my sticky thing, for want of a better phrase, and I just push it back through, if that makes sense. Try to keep hold of the end of it and keep it pushing on there until it comes out the other side. So once you can see that poking out the other side, just grab hold of it, pull that stick out, and then you're just going to pull the straw out by turning your strap back round to the right side. It's quite a satisfying job actually. There's our straw reappearing, and that's my strap all turned through. So now we're going to move on to the next stage. Now in the book it talks about view A, bodice first of all, and if you are using view A you're going to take out these big sort of darts here, and you're going to attach the panel at the centre front in much the same way as the gathered version, which I'm going to make. So just follow the instructions there if you're making view A, but there will be similarities with how this panel is attached. So I'm going to talk you through how to do view B and C, which is the gathered one. So the only difference really is gathers or those kind of big gigantic darts there. Okay, so for view B and C, and in fact view A as well, the first thing that we need to do is do some reinforcing stitching on the front in between these dots. So I've reinforced that area at the centre front on either side with a square of interfacing that I just cut out. I went a bit big actually, you could probably cut it slightly smaller, but you want to make sure that it covers those dots there because we're going to clip into those, and adding the interfacing just allows it to have that bit of extra strength. So what I'm going to do is I've then drawn with a heat erasing pen from 1.5 in from there along to that pink dot there, which is 1.5 in, down to the second pink dot that we transferred from our pattern marking and the back again. And we're going to use a stitch length of 1, so we're going to use a really short stitch length, and we're just going to sew along, down and along, and that's going to strengthen that area and give us a guide as well. So I've got a really short stitch length of 1, and making sure nothing's getting accidentally folded up beneath my sewing machine there, and off I go. It'll feel like you're sewing very slowly, but with that very short stitch length it'll take you a long time to travel. Get to the pink dot, making sure the needle is down, lift your foot, pivot and then come back down. And then all the way back here again. I'm not going to bother about any kind of back stitching or anything. There we go. Carefully draw that out without stretching the fabric. Whoops. And then I'm going to trim off those thread tails in a minute. So can you see? Where are we? So with a very, very short stitch along here, down here and back out there again. Okay, so now you can see, here's my front bodice there, and I've got my two areas where I've, in between that sort of letterbox, I suppose I'd call it there, where I've done that reinforcing. Now that I've done the reinforcing, I'm going to use my scissors to just stitch from here out into the corner, but making sure that I am not cutting through my stitches there. So as close as I can, but not through the stitches, to create a kind of a V shape or a Y shape. Yeah, nice into the corner. Do that on both sides. So I've laid this out flat so that we can see what we're doing. So there are my two reinforced areas at either side. Now what you're going to do is along this long edge here, you're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches. Now we're using a length of 1 for these. We're going to go in the opposite direction and use the longest possible length stitch we can do on our machine. I think it's about a 5 on my machine. And we're just going to start in here, and within the seam allowance, you've got a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. You're going to be within the seam allowance about 0.5 centimetre and 1 centimetre in from this raw edge here. You're going to sew all the way along there. Don't back stitch it at the ends, leave them open, and then we'll be able to tug on those ends and draw the fabric along to gather up this lovely long edge here. So there's my little area that I've just been working on, and I want to do those basting stitches down here, so I'm just going to lower my presser foot here, I want to do them within the seam allowance. I've changed my stitch length to 5, and now by contrast it's going to feel like we're sewing very quickly. Before it felt like we were sewing very slowly with those short stitch lengths. The fabric's now been pulled through quite rapidly. When you cut off your threads, make sure that you leave a nice long thread tail at either end for this, and then we're going to go back to the beginning again, and just below that first line of gathering stitching we are going to do another one. So just make sure that they don't cross over each other, they run parallel. Can you see those? 2 parallel lines of gathering stitch. So the next stage, we're going to leave those gathering stitches along that long edge there. We're going to leave those for the time being. We're going to come back to those in a minute. And I've got my reinforced areas there. There's my kind of elongated letterbox opening. So if you think about how this pattern works, there's your V-neck there. The next thing we're going to sew together is this seam here. So the first thing to do is just to finish the raw edges. You don't want it fraying. So if you're using a sewing machine, then you're going to do a zigzag stitch to finish those edges, or if you've got an overcast function on your sewing machine, then you can overcast them however you prefer, and that will stop them from fraying. I'm going to use my overlocker, so I've just got 3 threads on my overlocker, and I've taken off the left hand needle because I'm not actually stitching together, I'm just edge finishing, and I want to keep this as lightweight as I possibly can. So I'm just going to overlock those 2 raw edges, and then we're going to put them, once we've finished them, right sides together like so, and then, whoops, very slippery, and then once we put those right sides together, we're just going to sew down there with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance and press those seam allowances open. If you're using a sheer chiffon, if you're sort of feeling very brave, you could even do a French seam on that bit there, but just be conscious of the fact that you want to be able to create a nice sharp V. So unless you're doing a French seam, finish these separately and press them open, because then you'll get that nice sharp V shape at the top there. So those raw edges have now been overlocked in order to stop them from fraying, and I'm now going to put these fabric pieces right sides together and sew along with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to join those 2. Now, raw edges matching, or overlocked edges I should say. A few pins to hold in place, always pinning at right angles, and I take the pins out as I sew. So don't forget to put your sewing machine back to a normal length stitch after all that gathering and what have you. So you can see the shape there is like a little angle. This is 1.5 centimetres in, so that's going to give you a guide as to where you meant to start sewing as well. So just, you can use your guide on your stitch plate as well, making sure those raw edges are matching. A little back stitch to begin with. And off I go, making sure that my edges of my fabric there are lining up with that 1.5 centimetre line. And once I've finished sewing that, I shall go over to my ironing board and I'll press that seam open and flat. Back stitch at the end. There you go. And you can see that my stitching has started right at that angle there. Okay, centre front seam done and pressed flat and open. If you're doing the tie straps, the next stage is just a bit of preparation to attach your tie straps to your front panel. So take your interfaced front panel. I'm just going to fold mine in half lengthways and make a, can't pick up the scissors, make a tiny little snip there just to mark the halfway point. And then with that tiny little snip there, I'm going to take my raw edge of my strap and place it at that halfway point with a little bit sticking out there. So I want that to be at the halfway point and the raw edge just extending a little past. If when you pressed your strap you ended up with a little seam there, then my advice would be to make sure that the seam is looking at you, so that when this turns right sides out you'll have the non-seamed side looking at you. But that depends on how you pressed it and whether you've got a seam there. Same on the other side, so raw edge, this raw edge facing out here, make sure it's at the halfway point, and I'm looking at my seam there so that the nice side is together, right side's together with that panel. And I'll just pop a pin in there, oops, and I'm just going to, within the seam allowance, so about a centimetre in from the edge, I'm just going to stitch those in place. Repeating the same process for both sides and making sure that that strap is sat at right angles, it's not kicking off in a different direction. Just like that on both sides. Right, we're now going to move on to a slightly trickier part of this make. So I've got my camera set up so I'm looking at the wrong side of my dress here just so that you can see. So there's my centre front seam, there's my V-neck up there, there's my letterbox. Now what I've done is I've pressed up 1.5 here and I've pressed these triangles out to create a nice square opening. And then what we're going to work on next is this longer line here. So the first thing to do is we're going to gather in that line to create those gathers at the front. So if you take two of your thread tails, the two top ones, they might have become a little twisted together, so just separate them and then take two of those thread tails, hold on to them, and then just, so you're not holding the bottom threads, you're just holding the top ones. Whoops. And you're just travelling your fabric along that stitch line of basting stitches to create those beautiful gathers. And I would just sort of go into the middle there on that side and then start on the other side and do the same, kind of meet in the middle. I always start by gathering it up to the max, and then once it's all completely gathered up I kind of then sort of splay those gathers out to fit whatever it is they're sewing themselves to. So just coming in from the other side. There we go. That panel is now well and truly ruched up. So I've actually, by gathering that so much, I've now got it shorter than the top edge. You want it to end up eventually being the same length. So we're now going to tease those gathers back out until they're about the same length, or until they are the same length as the top, so you've got a nice even rectangle. So just gradually drawing that fabric back along. So once I've got those gathers drawn out so that they're roughly about the same, then we're going to flip this over to the other side and we're going to take the panel here, the front panel that we attached our ties to if we're using ties, or otherwise the interfaced panel, and we're just going to put it right sides together. And what we want to do now is we want to carefully match up the raw edge of the panel with the raw edge of this gathered area all the way along, and then we're going to sew it along our 1.5 centimetre line, and then it's going to sort of flip up like that. Okay, so it's right sides together along here, and just match that up so that the gathers are even across there, and then you're going to pin it, lots and lots of pins. Pins are your friends when you're coming to do this, and you're just going to sew along there in between those dots. So I want to put the 1.5 centimeters as my guide with my raw edge. Let's get my needle to anchor that down. And then as I go, I can just make sure that all of my gathers are facing in the right direction and that the raw edges are all up here. So I'm just going to sew with a straight seam, normal stitch length, back stitch at the beginning and the end. Take your time. Try to make sure that you haven't caught up anything, haven't got anything sort of caught up underneath, and I just take my pins out as I go. Sorry, is that a bit fuzzy? Hope you can see okay. So yeah, just make sure those gathers are nice. Moving my camera around so that you can see what I can see. I just even out those gathers as I go sometimes as well, if I see an area where they're all clumped together. Can you see how all those raw edges are matching up with that 15 line? Coming to the halfway point now. It's now sewn along that 1.5 centimetre line with the gathers along there. You can see how messy those basting stitches look against that nice neat stitch line there, but you can just whip those basting stitches out now if you want to. So I just come from in here, so all the way along there, and then your stitch line at the end should just come at that point where that corner is. So you're going to have a little bit of extra hanging out the end there. So this is what you should have. Yeah, there's your bodice panel there. I'm looking at the interfaced side. Raw edges matching, gathers are all on that edge there, and this is your letterbox style opening from where you pressed back those seam allowances at the edge. And the next stage is to take your panel and fold it to the inside of the dress, like so. Okay, so it's now on the inside, and there's your ties, if you're using them, are coming in like that. And then what you're going to do is take this side and fold it in, like so. And then the next thing that we want to do is sew together along here. So I've popped that under my machine, and I just want to make sure that everything is sitting nice and square and true. So the raw edge of this square here is exactly on the 1.5 guideline, a couple of stitches back and forth, and then off I go, and as I stitch down I shall be stitching along the edge of that triangle. Now if you feel like, gosh, this looks slightly beyond anything I've done before, and you're using rather special fabric, because it is a rather special fabric kind of pattern, then why not grab an old pillowcase and cut out just this element of the project and do a practice first of all, because obviously the first time you do something, the second time or third time you do it, it's always going to be, you're going to learn a few lessons. So if you're a bit kind of put off by this process, then why not grab a pillowcase and do that. Do the whole thing on a sort of scraps of fabric first to see how you get on. So there you go, there you can see my line of sewing along there, which should, if I turn it over, that's kind of along that pink chalk mark there. So I'm kind of beginning to construct my square. So I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. So you've sewn along there. Let's keep trimming off those extra thread tails as we go. Oops. And then what you're going to do is the same on the other side here. So it looks like that. And then the final one is along the top edge there. So you're going to repeat that same process along the top edge. And you just want to try and make sure that you're creating that nice square shape with a 1.5 cm seam allowance all the way around. So the next thing to do is just to line up the raw edges at the top and then sew. Bobbin fully reloaded. I'm going to cross that corner, lining up the raw edges, that 1.5 centimetre seam allowance line. So that's now sewn in all around those 4 lines. And you can see why it's really important to understand the seam allowance and also to have those 4 dots marked in the corner that you took from the pattern. You can just see the raw edges of my straps peeping out either side there. That obviously wants to sort of press itself up actually, that bit, because it's got all the gathers underneath it. But sort of that's what you're looking at there with the reverse of the dress. If I spin that round to the front, and I haven't pressed this yet, I've just finished sewing it. But then from the front, what you end up with, whoops, is, it needs a press, but you end up with that rectangle with the 2 straps coming out either side. And really, you know, it's a bit tricky to get those corners nice and flat. It needs a bit of a press, but if you kind of persevere with it, you'll get there. So the next thing to do is to flip this back round again, and we're going to neaten up the inside of our dress here. Okay, so we flip this round and we're now ready to do the next step, which is just to make the inside of this dress look a little bit neater and nicely finished. So you're going to take your other piece of bodice facing, and in the instructions there's 2 different methods for this. I'm going to use the hand stitching method because and you can do it by machine stitching and then folding up, and then but you're also going to need to do a bit of hand stitching to finish anyway. So considering that, I think let's just do hand stitched method. Had enough tricky machine stitching for one day, and it's nice and relaxing doing a bit of hand stitching anyway. So we're going to press these raw edges in on this panel here. So we're going to take this over and just press those so everything's sort of facing in. Then we're going to take our bodice facing panel and we're going to press that as well in along those pink lines, those 1.5 centimetre stitch lines. You might want to just go slightly outside of them to give yourself a slightly bigger panel, and then we'll place that on top of that and then just going to hand stitch around there just to neaten up everything, and all that raw edge and that facing will all be hidden underneath that panel. So over to the ironing board and then let's get hand stitching. So I've pressed all of that in now, and then I took my back panel and I've just pressed that in. I'm not worried about trimming away the corners or anything because I'm working with a pretty lightweight fabric and I think I can get away with it, but you can trim away the corners if you like on that one. So if you can see, if I place that on top there, you can see how that's going to end up looking. So I'll just pin that in place, and then I'm going to use just a hand stitch just to gently stitch that all the way around there, just to neaten off that the interior of that dress.